Okay, so this is going to be part 4 of the Prism Primer. This is going to be a little different. I'm just doing analysis of library, of just the one card, because it's a really interesting card and it's a really weird card. So there's not going to be any gameplay or anything like that, no play patterns or anything in this video. This is purely going to be numerical analysis of a card and how I look at it. This was a pet project for about a couple weeks back in, I think it was January or December timeframe. I think it was actually December. And it was really interesting stuff to me, and it was really cool. So I wanted to add it in because it is useful information. It's important information because library is a kind of crazy card. So the short version is library is wild. It's insane. 5 intellect is nuts. It's absolutely crazy. It's the equivalent of playing a Tome of Divinity online every turn with a light blue. Mostly. You don't get to dig 3 cards deeper into your deck and get that filtering, which is not irrelevant by any means, but just playing a 5-card hand every turn, a 5 intellect hero every turn, is kind of nuts, especially when you have these auras that cost 4 and 6. You start getting to do kind of ridiculous things, which isn't surprising. You're playing 5 intellect. People have theorized what a 5 intellect hero would have to look like to be balanced, and I assure you they don't have Prism's text. They don't have access to Light Illusionist cards. But we know library is powerful. We can see that pretty clearly. The issue is it good? Which is an entirely different question. Is it a good card to be playing? Is it a good card to be running? Because that is a different question than is it powerful, because is it good means it is powerful more often than it hurts us. And that we win more games because it's in the deck rather than we lose more games because it's in the deck. So how do we actually evaluate this card? Because it's not super easy to evaluate on the surface, because it's a 1-of in your deck, it's legendary keyworded, you don't always get the trigger, it's weird. But we can do a couple things to make this a little bit simpler. Library is good when it's drawing 3 or more cards. This means that you're going to spend 2 cards to play it, you're going to spend the card to pitch and the library itself, and then you need to draw 3 additional cards to get +1 on it. And this is if library's doing this, we're okay with it. We're generally pretty okay with it because we make up whatever we lose usually. Bad is less than that. Or if it ends up hurting us, if it's in the hand when we need to be able to block, or if it's in the hand when we need to be able to pressure somebody. It's a very forcing card. It has 1 mode, and that is play it. 1.25 modes. You can soul it to Halo or Genesis if you really need to. I've sold it to Genesis a few times. Put it in Soul with Genesis a few times. But you don't like doing that. But you also have to play it. You do not have a choice. You cannot block with it. You cannot pitch it. So you can't get it out of your hand otherwise. So it is fairly forcing, and it can very easily be in our hand and be just an absolutely dead card that we can't do anything with and actively hurt our game plan. So, and then one note, if it gets blown up, I'm considering that neutral. I'm not worrying about that because they have to spend 2 cards to do it. Yes, it has go again, whereas ours didn't. I'm not super worried about that. It depends a little bit on the game state. It's just kind of unfortunate, but I keep going, and I haven't ever been super worried about it getting blown up. Because it's also just fairly unlikely for that to happen, for them to have double yellows. That being said, this is a reason I don't bring it into Brute, because if they discard a Beast Within to it, they get the Beast Within trigger, they get the card back, and then we're down value for sure. So library is extremely difficult to evaluate with just math. With a hypergeometric calculator, you can't really do it. Not easily, I found. Because I sat down and I just looked at it, and it took about 5 minutes for me to be like, nah, I'm not doing this on a piece of paper. It's not going to work. Because you have to factor in when you find it, you have to factor in shuffling with when you search figments, because it's going to move around in your deck then. You have to factor in, when you get the draws, because you don't always get the draw, do you draw a hand that just has one yellow in it and four blues, or three blues and one yellow? Like, if you can't get library online, then it's also not good. So there's a lot of conditions that kind of have to be met, or a lot of different circumstances that can come up. And the cards that leave your deck change your odds of getting your library draws. If you block with, your first 8 cards are yellows and you have to get rid of all of them, then that matters. When the figments come out of your deck, those are yellows that are leaving your deck. That matters for library triggers. So these are things to take in that you would have to consider. And I wasn't sure how to do that by hand. So I reached into my, reached back towards my grad school time, and I decided to run simulations for it. Just hard program the simulations for playing a game with library in the deck and what it might look like. An estimate, not perfect estimate by any means, but I wanted something better than just, if it's a long game, it's good. If it's a short game, it's bad. I wanted something better than that. So, what did I set up to do this? Few things pretty easy to kind of check off. 60 card deck, side down to that each time. I set the blue count, and then I fill in the rest with one library, and the rest are yellows. So I think 15 blues is where I was putting this, and then library is the 16th card, and the other 44 are yellows. I'm just going to have it draw to intellect each turn. I'm not going to worry about arsenal. I'm going to have it play out every card, or assume it can play out every card. I didn't want to get too in the weeds with that, because we start having to worry about which yellows we're drawing and which ones we're not. I have it decide on each turn if we're blocking, and then I have it randomly decide each turn if we find a figment, or if a herald goes to soul and we tutor a figment, and then from there I have it determine how to play a hand. So with a 4-card hand or a 5-card hand, I say which cards are being played or blocked with, and then which cards are being pitched back into the deck. And that wasn't as hard as I thought it might be. A lot of the cases overlapped, where it's like, okay, these 8 cases are all pitch a yellow and a blue, and they all have this and this in common. So it was like the outlier cases where you have all yellows or all blues were like the kind of weird ones, where not even the yellow one, but like the all blue hands were weird. I think I put some reds in at one point where it was like also a little weird, where it'd be like red triple blue, what does the hand do? But it wasn't super hard to like kind of even just hard code those. It wasn't super bad, because there was only like 8 or 10 possible different combinations of cards getting pitched and put back into the deck. So not too bad, but also far from perfect. But I think still a decent estimate for what hands look like when you draw them in the Aura game plan. From there, we need life totals. We need a way to measure how much damage we're taking for making these plays on these turns, and also how much damage they're taking. So I just gave a baseline damage that we're taking each turn, and I just set that value, and then if library is in hand and we're forced to play it, I have it take a little extra damage. Actually, a decent chunk extra damage at the start. If we're saying no blocks, we're trying to... This is a separate modifier. So if library is in hand and we're saying no blocks, then we're taking probably a chunk of damage, a decent chunk of damage. But if library is not in hand and we just have a generic 4-card hand and I want to play the 4 cards, how do we say? We say no blocks and we take more damage for that turn, more effective. We pay effective life to take that turn. Another modifier, if library is out and we have 4 cards in hand, we're at 4 intellect, we're incentivized to pitch 2 yellows and get back up to that 5 intellect. If we have 5 cards, we're of course going to play it differently. So there's a modifier for how much we take there. We take a little bit less damage in this case because if we need to, we can block with a card and still get our library trigger. And I'm not super worried about that. We could flip an angel or however we want to do it. If we've had library out for more than 6 turns, or on for more than 6 turns, excuse me, then I start really decreasing the damage because we are really in our snowball at that point. And it's hard for us to lose games at that point, if I'm being honest. I've lost, I could probably count on one hand the number of games I've lost where library is out and it's been on for more than 6 turns. I don't know if I've actually lost any at that point. The games where library is out for that long, I'm generally not getting library effect is the actual issue. But this is what I'm trying to use to estimate like what library looks like in these games. If we've got 6 draws off library, we're probably in a good spot. Not necessarily, but we're probably in a good spot. And our issue at that point is not likely to be damage to face that we're taking. It's likely to be deck damage. Anyways, that's probably what we're losing by at that point. And then also a health modifier for if we tutor a figment, I give us a +4 because that's roughly what happens. There's also a very strong correlation I've found in games where it's like, yeah, if I have 3 figments out before my pivot turn, I'm in a pretty good spot, and I almost always have something to do, like, on the next 3 turns to really develop threats and board presence. So I have us gain a little bit of life there. So then what are we measuring? How do we want to, the basic things that we want to measure here is payoff. So it's a success if it draws us 3 or more cards, and it hurts us if it is in our hand in the turn we fall to 0 or in the 2 turns prior. Those are the conditions that I want to check. So with those conditions set, what we can do is we can have it start a game. It'll give us a 60 card deck that is randomized, and we can have it play through hands, and it's going to take some damage. And when it finds library, it'll play library, and then it's going to keep going. And if it hits 10 plus draws, I have it end. But we start, I have it end and count that as a success. But we're only looking for really this +3 cards that we're worried about. Every time it draws library, it will play it. It's forced to. So from there, I went and I put values in for all of these numbers. All of them got a value that I just set that I thought was a pretty good estimate of what was happening at the time. If I were to play like new, what would it look like? And from there, I got a data set. I was trying to be cute at first and have it run tournaments and randomize my matchups and change the meta that I face as rounds went on, but I ended up kind of just ditching that. So I ended up with about 500,000 games of data. So 500,000 games where I would run library. In about 10% of those games, it was in our 2 hands before we lost. So it was an active detriment, presumably, in 10% of games. Like active detriment. That's not insignificant. That's about, if you make top 8 of a battle hardened, that's about one of your games, if you play all 10 on auras. One of those games you lose to library. That's not great, in all honesty. I don't love that. Now, we're not playing Aura Plan into everything. I would say you probably play somewhere around 3 to 5, depending on the exact meta and your luck as well. But in 54% of those games, library drew us 3+ cards. That's pretty good. 54% is a really good number of games to be hitting with this card, for it to be like doing its thing. And it drew 12.5 cards on average for that. I was having it start dealing damage each turn after like library gets online, and like once we had 3 figments out, I would have it start dealing damage to them instead of me. And drawing 12.5 cards is like, you will bury somebody in that card advantage. They can't come back from that. That's someone's entire life total. That is 37.5 points of value, presumably, if you put a card at 3 value. That is someone's entire life total. That just wins games. Turns per win is going to be longer than turns per loss. That's not surprising. When we lose, it's because we get beat up before we can set up. Turns per win is when we get to grind out our value and get set up, turn the corner, and then we have to take 12 turns to get their life total to 0. Turns to find library on average was 6.25. That's not too surprising, because there are some games where you just don't find library at all. And I could have put that at a 15 value, but I think I summarized it well in the next stat of games where we even found library was right about 2/3, just over, which isn't great, but generally I'm having those games set as a loss, and they're not necessarily a loss in reality. So it's not a perfect estimate here for kind of what's going on, but it's interesting that we only find it in that percentage of games, which also is not too far off reality, in my opinion. I would say 70% of games, I'm probably finding it. Actually, 2/3 is probably pretty on the nose. Those numbers aren't far off each other, but two out of 3 is probably about right, I think. And then overall win rate, 55%, but win rate when library was out is 80%. That's pretty good. That's pretty darn good. That says the card is powerful, because that's an extra 25% win rate when you get library out. And then percent of games where library drew 3+ cards when played is almost 80%. That is that's pretty darn good. That means that it is doing its thing 4 times more often than it's not. So 4-1 odds on, so 20% of the time you don't get 3 cards out of it. And I think less than that is going to be active detriment, and some of those are going to be break even where it's 2 cards, but those are also probably still being counted as losses. However, this data set bugged me a little bit. There was an issue with it. And the issue was I had set all of our damage numbers. I had set how fast we were taking damage. And that isn't necessarily wrong. The problem is that only represents a very specific, it's not even a meta that it represents. It's a specific deck that it represents. So this doesn't tell me if library is good or not overall. This data set right here tells me if library is good against a certain deck that has those exact numbers. So this is not a general solution to is library good or not. This is not the whole picture. This is a single pixel in the entire picture that is the meta. So I need to figure out how I can actually determine whether or not library is good. And I need to do that in the context of when is it good? Because it's not actually, like, I've determined for this deck, against this deck, that library has some decent payoff. It has some really decent payoff. It still can hurt us a bit, but it has some really solid payoff. So the thing is, I can either measure this deck, the deck we're pitting Prism against and library against, as I can either measure it by the damage numbers or the number of turns we get. And this number of turns we get is much easier to use. It's much easier to measure things by. It's much easier to look at the meta with that in mind. It's much easier to look at each individual matchup with that in mind. Because setting those damage numbers is basically arbitrary. Like, I just I could have randomly picked those numbers, and it was only a single point of data. So I went through and I had it vary all of the damage numbers. Every single one of those values, all 6 of them, all of them got varied over a range of values from very low damage amounts and from our opponent and very high damage amounts for us when libraries like going and our angels are supposed to be swinging. And then all the way to reverse, where the meta is super aggro and hostile to us and we can't compete, basically. So this is going to create for us a general solution where we can say, for how fast our opponent is, for how fast the game is, we can get a percent chance that library pays off and a percent chance that library hurts us off of something that we can measure in reality with 5 games. And then we can come back to this data set and we can use it. So vary all the damage numbers, and that determines the speed of our meta. It's not actually, but we can turn that into turns per game. And this becomes our measuring stick. This says we can put Verdance here at 20 turns per game, and we can put New here at 18 turns per game, and we can put Aurora here at 5. And we can look at where library falls, and we can say, assuming everything about the simulation is reasonable, we can say how good library is or isn't. And that's an actual general solution because I don't have a say in the numbers, in the inputs anymore, whereas that first data set was arbitrary. This is an actual piece of data that I think can be used. I ended up with over 144,000 different sets of damage numbers. It was a lot. It was more than I had anticipated. So instead of 500,000 games per data set, I have to do 5,000. And what I have it spit out is that graph, this chart up here. And then I have it have it average these two. Not directly average, but weighted average based on wins and losses. And I get how many turns per game were played for this set of damage numbers. And then I get the relevant info. So how often it drew us 3+ cards and how often it hurt us. So once I have that, I have it put a data set in a bucket where it's like if the average turns were 10.0667 for that set of damage numbers, I would put it in the bucket that is 10.0 to 10.1. And all the data in that bucket gets averaged for payoff and hurt numbers and for any other value that I wanted out of it. Payoff and hurt were the two main ones that I pulled. And I could pull averages, minimum, maximum, and then standard deviation as well for that bucket. So when there were this many turns per game, how much variance did I have between different types of damage sets? Because different damage sets, we could have one number go up 3 and one number go down 3 and then swap them. And we could end up in the same turns per cycle, but it's a different damage set. And library could act differently in those games. So we can get a minimum and maximum, and we can get an average. So from there, we can just put it on a graph. And we have the percent chance that it pays off. This is the yellow line here in the middle is the average. And then I have one standard deviation above and below it. So, like at 15% here, or at 15 turns per game, we have right about 60% chance to pay off, which isn't too surprising given our first set of simulations. We were about 5% shy and our average turns were about 14. Not too surprising. And then our variance is still pretty high. This is one standard deviation, so 88% of games should fall between the blue dot and the red dot for any given length of average length of game. That's still a pretty large margin when we're maxing out at about 60+% and we're bottoming out at somewhere probably about here, just over 25%. That's a lot of variance still. Because while we have this decent average that is a pretty nice consistent increase, we've still got a lot of variance. And this is reasonably consistent or this continues, this trend continues when we look at the hurt percentage. I only have it go up to 40% here. So we start out at about 25% for it to hurt us, which isn't too surprising. Even at 5 turns per game, we're just not likely to see it. So it's not likely to hurt us because we don't draw it. Now, you can you could normalize this data by the number of turns that you're going and say, instead of what are the odds that library hurts me, you can go, what are the odds that library hurts me when I draw it? And this number is very close to 100%. This is not normalized by the number of games you see it. And I might go back and pull that data because that would be very interesting. It would change the way this graph looks a lot, because this is just 25% of raw games are affected by library, which that might be better for a tournament because you're just not going to see library every time. So this is more true to reality, but not true to the times you draw library, which are two different questions in my mind. They're related, and they're both kind of important, but they're not the same question. But we see a nice consistent trend downwards, almost to basically 0%. It's still probably about 2% or something like that. But it's a very steady downward trend, and there's still a lot of variance, especially early, of course. But even at 10 turns per game, we still have a lot of variance where it's up at 25 still, and then down to 12-ish, 13-ish. That's pretty high variance. This 15 mark is the most interesting for me, and I'll come back to that at the end. But yeah, there's 88% of games roughly would fall between. You should expect 88% of your games to fall between these two bands, or 88% of your tournaments, where it's the number of, if you were to take a 10 game set, how often did library hurt you? It should be somewhere. Most of those sets will fall between whatever percentage. Now, 5,000 games times 144,000 data sets is 720 million plus games. That's a lot. And this is all I could get it to converge to. That's how much data is in here, and that's how much variance we still have in library. That's nuts. That's crazy. That's how high variance this card is. It's legendary keyworded. It's incredibly forcing. It's incredibly powerful when it works because it just snowballs on itself. And it's still, you can't get tighter results than this. Or I couldn't. Someone might be able to if they wanted to dig further on this. But this is insane. This is wild. 720 million data points. And this is it still looks like this. We still have gaps of, it's crazy, 20, 30% gaps. It's crazy. But this is just standard deviation. This is 88% of games. What does 100% of data look like? It looks like that. I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit just to show how much it's moving. The payoff doesn't increase much, or the payoff maximum doesn't increase much, but the minimum bottoms out. You can have full data sets with 10 turn average that are basically 0% library showing up. And that's that's going to happen. We had that. But I don't know how many games where it just didn't show up. That's crazy. And it jumps to 35% at about the same point. 10 turns per game is your highest variance point for library. Your average isn't terrible. It's 30%. It's 30% to 20%. That's not even good. This variance, honestly, if there's anything that you take away from this, it's that the variance of library is massive. It is massive. And we already kind of knew that. We know what it feels like to have library pop off and have it not. But this was putting numbers to this variance is I can't fully comprehend it. And I've been staring at these numbers for months. I just kind of look at them like, okay, I just have to accept that this, like, I either I'm okay with it or I'm not at this point, and that's it. I can't try to understand what this means for, like, for playing the card in a single game. In a single game, let alone a single event. Like, the part that you really have to accept with library is not that sometimes you will lose the game because of it. It's that you can't, it is so difficult to reasonably predict what library is going to do to a tournament run. It is so, you, I don't know if I can justify predictions on what library does to a tournament run because of this. These are 5,000 game data sets, and some of them bottom out at 0% payoff with 10 turns. Like, it makes me think this is wrong sometimes, that I, like, messed up. Like, but the card is that high variance. It really is. So there are some things I didn't account for in this 100%. Genesis triggers, cards going into Soul there, disappearing from the deck, and then drawing cards, especially for filtering to get extra library triggers, 100% something I take into account. Halo, Shariah draws, Erudition draws. None of those are accounted for, which obviously increase your library percentage hit chance. Other aura effects like Merciful, and then you play a yellow aura off a light blue or something like that. That's not included. And Arsenal. Like, none of these. You can also, like, min-max some of these play patterns to get more library hits than what my program was doing. It would cover, like, 8 different outcomes for, like, 20 different possible colors of hands. So there's a lot of things I didn't account for here, but I thought this was, like, a reasonable approximation, and maybe one of the better approximations that people have done for library. Because I also wanted to see what happened when it was played. Because that's really hard to measure. It is. So there's still a lot that I didn't account for. But the takeaway from this is I don't have a good answer if library is good or not. I think that's up to you. At what point is it worth it? What is your minimum for payoff, and what is your maximum for hurting you? What is the ratio of those success to fail that you need to have? Does it need to be 2-1, 4-1, 6-1, 10-1 in a matchup to pay off or succeed? What does that need to be? What does the difference need to be? Do you need to have, like, does it need to be a 50% difference? Can it be a 10% difference? Like, how much risk are you willing to accept on that? How often does it even come in? With those numbers in mind, how often does it come in? How many games is it going to come in during a tournament run? How many matchups does it come in for? Because then if you have a meta share that you're predicting, you can say it's going to come in for this many games. And then you can decide, is it even necessary? Because then the follow-up question for that is, how many of those games do you win even if you don't have library? Because the question is not necessarily, this is just the first question. Is library good? Can it be good? The next question is it good enough to warrant a slot in your deck? Are you likely to win more games because you just put an extra Herald in your deck than you put instead of library? Did you actually just win more games? It's possible. It's definitely possible. But that's something these are the choices that you're going to have to make, because the card is so high variance, I can't tell you if it's good or not. I can tell you that I still play it, but I'm really not playing it in all matchups. So I'm going to leave this little graph here, or this table. This is kind of what I'm going by. I'm in about this 15 turn mark. This is where I want library. Anything less than that, and I don't really like it, among a couple other conditions. But I need these games to be long. Like, average 15 turns, that means we're hitting second cycle and a half at least, which means this is new, can be Azuri. Victor is getting a little weird, depending on how aggressive he is. But like Bravo, probably bring it in. Jarl for sure bringing it in. Enigma's a little weird, where I'm not 100% sure, but like the snowball in that matchup is so good that I think the increased variance is worth it. This one's up to you. This is my data. This is where I'm at. These are my conclusion is that anything after like 15 turns is worth it. Anything less than that is sketchy. But yeah, library's a wild card. It's crazy. The variance is insane, but it's so powerful. Like it is so powerful. I don't know. This one's up to you guys. Thanks for watching. I think I'm gonna have something special coming back next week. I probably won't have an upload this weekend, even if I would like to. I think I'm gonna be able to do the Vincent video for sometime next week. So look out for that if you're interested. I've gotten a lot of questions about that matchup, and I'm starting to really figure out where I'm at on it and how to talk about it. So I'm excited to do that one. So with that, peace.